Hi, this is Connie Giordano with Walking in Truth Ministry. Join me now as I deliver this stirring message from God's holy word. Would you say that today's modern day church is more like Israel or more like Judah of old? In Jeremiah 3, we find the Lord referring to Israel as backsliding Israel and Judah as treacherous Judah. I ask you again, would you compare some in the modern day church, especially the American church, to backsliding Israel or to treacherous Judah? Let's examine Jeremiah 3, 6 through 11 to find our answer. First of all, as a matter of history, Israel was a single body long before Jeremiah's time. The country was broken up into two entities, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. The capital of the northern kingdom was Samaria, while the capital of the southern kingdom was Jerusalem. The prophet Jeremiah compared Israel and Judah to two sisters, Israel being the older one, while Judah was the younger. In Jeremiah 3:6, the Lord inquired, "Hast thou seen that which backsliding Israel has done?" The northern kingdom of Israel abandoned the Lord. She abandoned Yahweh's worship altogether. She abandoned herself to impiety. She ignored the warnings of the prophets. She openly rebelled against God. She refused to return to him at his call. Hers was an utter desertion of him. As divine punishment for her gross idolatry and apostasy, she was taken captive by the Assyrians in 722 BC. She was driven into exile. Israel was destroyed. Jeremiah 3:8 describes her exile in this way. "And I saw, when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a bill of divorce." Apparently, in certain cases of divorce, two proceedings were necessary. First, a certificate or bill of divorce had to be given to the wife. Second, the husband had to send his wife away. God, as the offended party, did both to backsliding Israel, his apostate people. Because of her spiritual adultery, Israel was divorced from God and sent away into exile by the Assyrians in 722 BC, an exile from which she did not return. But what about Judah? Why did God refer to her as treacherous Judah? We saw why he referred to Israel as backsliding Israel. But for what reason would he label Judah as being treacherous? Would he label some in his church today as being treacherous? In Jeremiah 3:7, God initially refers to Judah in this way when he says, "And I said, after she, Israel, had done all these things, turn thou unto me, but she, Israel, returned not. And her treacherous sister, Judah, saw it." With open eyes, Judah saw the shameful idolatry of Israel. She saw what her sister Israel had suffered as a result of her apostasy. She saw what happens to a people who turn away from God, choose their own way, worship idols instead of the living God, ignore God's warnings through the prophets, and refuse to turn from sin and turn back to Him. She saw how God has zero tolerance for the sin of idolatry in His people. She saw how God divorced Israel and sent her away into exile by the Assyrians. She saw Israel's destruction as a result of her sin. Judah saw the idolatry of Israel and what followed. She saw the Assyrians invade Israel. She saw the Assyrians destroy Israel. She saw the Assyrians take the Israelites as captives to their land. Did she fear? Absolutely not. In fact, Jeremiah 3:8 tells us, "And I, the Lord, saw, when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a bill of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah feared not, but went and played the harlot." Judah witnessed Israel's refusal to repent. She witnessed what Israel did and what came of it. She had warning of Israel's example and ruin. She should have taken warning. Instead, she despised it. She refused to learn from her older sister's tragic experience. With open eyes, knowing the doom, she trod the same course. She failed to profit by the solemn lessons of her sister's sin and ruin. The NIV Biblical Theology Study Bible explained it in this way: "The Lord's judgment of the northern kingdom of Israel should have acted as a warning to the southern kingdom of Judah. But Judah did the same thing as Israel." Matthew Henry added, "Judah saw what Israel did and what came of it, and should have taken warning. Israel's captivity was intended for Judah's admonition, but it had not the designed effect." Judah ignored not only the prophets, but also Israel's example. She witnessed the destruction of Israel and its people being taken captive to Assyria, yet she persisted in her sin. She witnessed God's dealings and their consequences, yet she remained unmoved. But why did God refer to her as being treacherous? The answer is found in Jeremiah 3:10, which says, "And yet for all this, her treacherous sister Judah hath not turned unto me with her whole heart, but feignedly, saith the Lord." Judah played the hypocrite. She continued to worship God, yet privately embraced idols. She thought she was secure because she had the Levites for priests and the sons of David for kings. She experienced a simulated reformation in the time of Josiah. It turned out to be a show. She did not truly repent of the sin of idolatry. Certainly, Israel's removal from the land should have removed her from this sin, but it did not. Judah was treacherous. She sinned against more means and mercies. She failed to realize the fundamental principle as outlined by Jesus in Luke 12:48, which says, "For unto whomsoever much is given, of him shall be much required." In other words, the greater the privilege, the greater the responsibility. The Zondervan Illustrated Bible Background Commentary said, higher standards are demanded of those who have been given greater gifts and abilities. The Believer's Bible Commentary said, those who have come to know God's will as it is revealed in the Scriptures are under great responsibility to obey it. Much has been given to them. Much will be required of them. The ESV Reformation Study Bible said, people are punished for failing to do right as well as for doing wrong. Ignorance can be blameworthy when there is the opportunity to know what is required. God makes his people's duty plain. So I ask you again, would you compare some in the modern day church, especially the American church, to backsliding Israel or to treacherous Judah? What about you? What do you see? Do you see God displaying his wrath on sin, especially the sins of abortion and same-sex marriage? Do you see his judgment in the land? Is it causing you to fear? Or like Judah, have you become so complicit with those who endorse these practices? God intends for you to learn from what you see. He is allowing you to see so that you will turn unto him with your whole heart, not feignedly as Judah did. Matthew Henry said, God's judgments upon others, if they be not the means of our reformation, will help to aggravate our destruction. He also said, it is evidence of great stupidity and security when we are not awakened to a holy fear by the judgments of God upon others. The Family Bible Notes added, when men refuse to take warning from the punishment of those whose sinful example they are imitating, they aggravate their guilt and bring upon themselves severer judgments. God does not take it lightly when his church, which has the warnings of the Holy Scriptures, professes to be walking with him, yet dances to the music of the ungodly culture. He does not take it lightly when his church embraces the world's ungodly agendas and endorses their wicked principles, which he hates. When she does this, she becomes treacherous like Judah. Judah saw, feared not, and played the hypocrite, pretending to know God, but in works denying him. She pretended to be in right standing with God, but was just as idolatrous as Israel. In fact, she was in worse shape because she knew better. She had more light. God called her treacherous. What does he say about you?